Hi, I'm Gavin.
I'm Ryan.
And welcome back to the Sound Project. All right, Ryan, today we are going to talk about the top 5 acoustical issues in houses of worship and how to solve them.
Yeah.
This is a segment of our business. We do probably 30% of our work is houses of worship.
Yep.
And we love getting involved with these types of projects. They're just a different challenge than studios that make up the majority of our work.
Yeah.
But it's really just a fulfilling thing for me personally, and I just love working with these churches to get better sound in their spaces.
Yeah.
And so we just want to kind of go through just some of the common top things that we see as issues in these houses of worship and some of the techniques to solve them.
Yep.
The first thing that we're going to look at is reverberation time. So excessive reverberation is a common problem in a lot of these spaces because they're large and typically built out of a lot of hard reflective surfaces. And so with that, you end up having reverberation. And the definition of reverberation time is the time it takes for sound to decay by 60 decibels in a room. Okay, so you imagine going into a room, clap your hands, approximately how many seconds it takes for that to die out. Now, it's frequency dependent. So if there's lower frequency, reverb is going to be potentially longer or shorter than the mid and high frequency reverb times. And so you have to measure it properly. Hand clap isn't going to tell you everything, but it's just a good assessment of the room. But if you get gear in there, you can start to measure it and figure out where it's at across the frequency spectrum. Typically, the reverb time for speech should be pretty short. Like you don't want a lot of echo happening when someone's trying to speak because then you can't understand speech very well.
Right.
So for music applications, though, like for choir or organs or orchestral music, usually you want a really long reverb time because that's those environments usually work better for music and people feel more like a warmth and a musicality in spaces that have a longer reverb time. So it's a challenge in houses of worship because a lot of times you're doing both.
Right.
You've got speech on Sunday for a sermon or someone giving an announcement, but then you might have a rock band playing the next time, or you could have a choir up there or an organist. So our job is always to try to make the room sound the best that it can for all applications rather than maybe sometimes just focusing in on one. Now, there's some things you can do with adaptive treatment where you can have the room change depending on what's happening that given day. However, those are usually harder to implement, more expensive, and something that's just not in a church's budget to do that. But it is possible with some things like curtains or panels that flip or different things like that.
Do you also want to talk about why the RT is so important, why it needs to be lower for voices versus all right, what if we have this insane RT? How is that going to impact speech?
Yeah. So anytime have you ever been in a cave before?
Yeah.
And spoken and you hear just the long reverb tail that happens and it's always hard to understand speech in those situations because by the time you've said one word and then you're moving on to the next word, that word you just said is still taking a long time to decay. So in some of these spaces that have reverb times of 3, 4, 5 seconds long, the words just start to jumble together. You can't pick out the words very well. It's also very hard to understand consonant sounds in a long reverb tail because all the differences in the C and T and S, that's all high frequency sounds. And if the high frequency reverb time is really long, then good luck, right?
Yeah.
It's really hard to be able to understand that. And when we go into these spaces, reverb times in larger rooms is probably the number one metric that we're looking at,
right?
Because it just impacts everything. And we also, given a room's size and application, there's going to be a target reverb time that's the best for that environment.
Sure.
And so we will select that as part of our job as a acoustical consultant. We'll let people know, here, this is what we should be targeting, and then try to figure out what we can do to the room to get there.
Sure. And that's something too that even on the website, we have the RT simulator where you can hear what the sample sounded like before and after treatment, and it's wild what the differences are.
Yeah, and it's really tough for churches, like if they're building a new space, to understand the ramifications of some of the decisions they're making in the design process with the architect and interior designer, like how that's going to impact the room itself. And that's where we come in and we can create those cool simulations where they can hear what someone speaking or what a choir or what a praise band would sound like in a room before it's even built, you know, and it avoids a lot of problems. And it's always harder to treat acoustics after it's been built, like, because by then that money is coming out of a different budget. Like it's not just wrapped into the overall cost of building the building. But then also you're having to shut down services and you know, add all these acoustical treatments. And then it also can sometimes look like an afterthought and visually not be what people want either. So planning early on, I always tell people if you're working on a church project and you don't know if it's the right time to get us involved or not, it is the right time. Like the earlier we can get involved, the better it can be, because we can make adjustments and make it a better result for everybody. So some of the solutions for excessive reverberation would be absorption and diffusion products. Absorption would be something like a fabric-covered fiberglass panel, or sometimes there's some spray applied materials like K13 that you can put on the roof of your building. There's anything that's soft and porous, that's going to be an absorber, and it depends on the thickness of the absorber. You know, the thicker the panel is, the lower in the frequency range it's going to handle. And so it's choosing the right types of acoustical panels to solve the issues that you find in your testing or your modeling. Typically, absorption goes on the rear wall and balcony faces. You know, anything behind the listener, if it comes back to your ears, it's usually not helpful. Like it's usually going to harm your experience. So that rear wall and the balcony face, usually absorbing that pretty heavily is advised. And then on the side walls, you can use more of a combination of absorption and diffusion, because you can scatter some of that energy. Because if you overabsorb sidewalls, you can end up harming things. Yeah, because some of the people in the back of the auditorium are relying on the reflections from the sidewalls to combine with the direct sound and give them more reinforcement. And if you just overabsorb sidewalls, then the room becomes very dry and dead. And you also, another impact of doing that would be that people don't sing, you know, and participate as much because they feel like everyone can hear all the good and bad notes they're singing. And so it's important to make sure that you choose the right product for the right location in the room. You don't want to overtreat. That's something I see in so many churches, to where it seems like almost every square inch available is covered with like a 1-inch thick acoustical panel. For one, 1-inch treatment really doesn't have a place in a large environment like that where music is being played. 1 inch is usually reserved, for us at least, would be more of like office environments or like telemarketing places, like something where it's just voices only. But when music gets involved, a 2-inch thick panel is actually almost 7 times as effective as a 1-inch panel at absorbing lower frequencies. And it's just a little bit extra thickness there can go a long way when it comes to absorbing those sounds. But you just don't want to blanket all the walls, because if you just cover the whole room with acoustical panels, it will most likely absorb high frequencies too much, and then the lows won't be handled enough, and then you end up with this imbalance that makes it hard for speech. Yeah. And for best results, you know, it's always good to ask for help. Like, that's why companies like ours exist, and others. It's good to get a professional involved when you're going into a new building project or trying to renovate an existing one. All right, the next issue, number 2 here, is slapback or flutter echo. And these are a couple, you know, it's different than reverberation time, because reverberation time is more of a how the sound lingers in the room. These are specific things that you know, can be problematic and distracting for people in a room. So what is flutter echo? Well, first I'll look at slapback. Slapback echo is a delayed sound that's coming typically from behind when you're in the space like this. And what I'm showing on the screen right now is actually an impulse response of a church. And since the speed of sound is constant, it's around 1.13 feet per millisecond, we could run something like this where at time equals 0 is the direct sound hitting the microphone from the speakers, and then that energy is cut off, and all these spikes that you see over time, this x-axis is time here, all of these spikes that pop up are actually reflections coming from some surface in the room. Right. And that information wouldn't really be helpful unless we can then dig into and figure out how long that had to travel, and then back into the distance it had to travel, because the speed of sound is a constant. And so I've shown on here the floor bounce happens there at around 7 milliseconds. You know, it's right after the direct sound. It's just a skipping of the sound off of the floor. Didn't have to travel very far to get to the microphone, so it arrives pretty early. Then you have the balcony face here at about, I'd say that's about almost 60 milliseconds or so. And that balcony face is a pretty sharp reflection, and that's usually the case because a lot of times it's a hard surface, sometimes it's glass, sometimes it's even curved or concave, which can focus energy. But the balcony face is usually an issue. Then the rear wall happens about 12 milliseconds later. And the reason it's 12 milliseconds later is because it's further back. You know, a balcony sticks out, and it's closer to the microphone than what the rear wall would be, so it takes a little bit more time, shows up later on this impulse response. Along with the sidewalls, that is a cluster of a lot of different reflections here in the 80 to 90 millisecond range, and then you've got the rear corners, which are much less in energy, but still show up on this type of plot. So it's important to find out exactly where these slapback echoes are coming from, or where these reflections are coming from, and be able to treat them effectively. The other thing we talk about is flutter echo. One of these, we kind of group these two things together. But flutter echo is anytime you have parallel surfaces that are hard and reflective, sound can bounce back and forth and just linger over time because of that. If you've ever been into a room that has parallel walls and you clap your hands in there and you hear like a ping pong ball bouncing back and forth, that's flutter echo. And what you're actually hearing is the delay of the sound hitting one surface, then back to another, then back to another. Because if there's not absorption material on those walls, it can just keep on going until it naturally dies out because of hitting that surface. It reduces in energy over time.
Sure.
So this image here I'm showing is a ray tracing diagram we did of a church, and you see this concentration of blue lines, and that's because these two walls are parallel, and that's flutter echo. That's a visual representation of flutter echo that's just happening back and forth. So there's this other thing here where we talk about why does 70 milliseconds matter. It's kind of like the cutoff, and there's an argument where it could be 50 to 80 milliseconds, like somewhere in that range, but around 70 milliseconds. If a sound arrives back to your ears 70 milliseconds or later after the direct sound, you hear it as a separate sound source. Like your brain can't process it. For instance, if it happens at 20 milliseconds after the direct sound, your brain will just factor that in and sum it all together, and that's what you just think the sound source sounds like.
Okay.
But if it happens outside the 70 millisecond window, then it's a distraction and kind of like, what is that sound? You know, like, and if you ever hear in like a live music venue, if they're doing sound check and then they hit the snare and you hear the snare coming out of the speakers, or you're close enough to the stage where you hear the actual snare just acoustically, and then you hear another snare coming from behind you, you know, and that is something where it's because that rear wall is further than 70 milliseconds out, then your brain can hear it as a separate sound source.
Interesting.
So with that rear wall reflection and that snare drum that you keep hearing hitting off the back wall, what's crazy is if you were to take that snare drum off the stage and hit it on the stage, you'd hear it off the back wall. But if you started walking towards the back wall and kept hitting it, at some point you will no longer hear that reflection off the back wall because you'll be within that 70 millisecond window, and your brain can no longer tell that reflection's coming from that. And so it just starts to sound like the snare drum, you know. Wow. But you actually might walk far enough that you'll start to hear it reflecting off the stage wall, and then you'll hear it coming off that surface. And it's all about that kind of 70 millisecond window and where we can start to discern what a reflection is versus what a direct sound is.
Sure.
So untreated rear walls and balcony faces is unwanted slapback. That's why we treat those surfaces first. The speakers are facing it, and it's putting the brunt of the energy towards that surface. Also, people standing on stage, musicians, their energy is traveling out that direction. So it's better just to absorb it so it's not a distraction for people. So looking at this impulse response is a little different than the one that I had labeled with the floor bounce and the balcony face. There's one big reflection that's happening at around 110 milliseconds or so. And that would be very, very noticeable to somebody because it's outside of that 70 millisecond window, that reflection would be really problematic. The other thing I want to show here is this ray tracing diagram of this church that we just recently worked on. And it's kind of like a strange football shape, and it's got concave surfaces in some different areas. And notice how all the focusing off the back wall, this kind of slap back and focusing that happens at these different microphone locations, and that's all due to this concave surfaces. So a flat rear wall is bad. A concave rear wall is even worse. And so it's good to avoid those for these slapback and flutter echo issues. So how you treat these things, it's similar to the reverberation time where you're using targeted treatment that is going to be effective at the frequencies you're having problems with. So usually it's absorption treatment. Diffusion on the rear wall of a church is usually not warranted. It doesn't mean it can't be useful maybe really high up on the back wall where it's not getting that direct sound, but you're still wanting to scatter some energy. But we rarely put it down low because it's something where we just want to kill that energy rather than redistribute it. And fan-shaped rooms is another way to handle flutter echo, because if you angle your walls out, so you have the stage up front and then you angle them out, then you don't have parallel surfaces side to side for the sound to create a flutter echo.
Sure.
All right. Issue number 3, we've got stage volume and resonance. This is a common problem when you have a large space and you have a big stage that you're creating. A lot of times people, when they build it just to save cost and to build it pretty quickly, or maybe they want to put storage underneath the stage itself, is that they will just leave it hollow. And the problem with a hollow stage, one, it makes it difficult as a musician because you're constantly trying to find your tone because you have this big resonant cavity underneath your amps or anything like that. Drum sets also are going to activate that resonance inside the stage. But I always tell people it's like having a big kick drum in your system without having a fader for it. Right? It's like you have this big resonant cavity, and so it's important to not have this type of resonance that goes on. Hollow stages are typically a problem with that, especially when you're placing instruments directly on the stage or amplifiers, subwoofers, things like that. And a lot of times from a resonant stage, sometimes you get poor clarity as a musician. You don't hear yourself quite as well because a lot of the energy is lost into that structure, that you end up turning your amps up. And so it creates a stage volume issue, and people are getting louder and louder as the service goes on. And so I want to show this picture of a church that we did up in Elkhart, Indiana. That's me up front by the stage there. I was there doing some testing, and we were looking at the sound quality of the room. That was one of the objectives, but one of the things they struggled with the most was that stage was completely hollow, and it was just this big resonant cavity that caused problems. And in fact, when I did the testing in this room, when we looked at waterfall plots, you could see the frequency that it was the stage was kind of tuned at, lingering in the room for 3 or 4 times as long as any other frequency. And so this stage was a big headache for them, and they're just like, I don't care what it takes, I just need it. I need it gone, right? And so most of the time it's enough to be able to just fill the cavity with insulation. It's like imagine putting a pillow into a kick drum, how that reduces the resonance. If you fill the cavity underneath the stage with insulation, it's going to do the same thing. And so you can usually get away with just doing that. However, if the stage, like the top of the stage, was built with really lightweight materials, like it's like kind of flexible, sometimes you also need to add mass to the top of the stage, because if there's more mass, that lowers the resonant frequency and less chance for it to get excited. So we also do that. In this case, in that project I just showed you, they actually braced it for making sure that it was structurally sound, and then filled the stage with sand.
Wow.
So the whole thing got filled with sand, which is a ton of sand, obviously, because that stage, when you look at the picture of it, it comes up to, right around a little past waist height, and it's a very large stage. But they were so tired of that. They're like, give us your best solution, and that's what we want to do. So filling it with mass like that, like sand, there's no chance for it to resonate anymore.
So why sand over just like regular insulation?
Well, it's just more dense, and it really fills that air cavity up. It's like anytime you have like sand to where there's no the cavity is eliminated pretty much because it's filled with something solid.
Okay,
yeah,
that makes sense. Wow.
Yeah, and the other thing with stage volume and resonance solutions, in-ear monitoring systems, and also absorbing energy on the stage, it's really going to go a long way. Keeping a quiet stage means there's less chance for that reflected energy to then have to fight with the PA system, because that's a lot of times you have the live band sound plus the PA system, plus reflections off the rear and side walls. You just want to try to rely mostly on the PA if you can. So having a silent stage can be really good. Isolating the stage, I mentioned that, and then also decoupling your amps and subwoofers and drums. There's different isolation platforms you can buy to go underneath these amps and subwoofers, and even your drum set, that will help reduce that vibration before it even gets into the structure, which it's always best to cut it out at the source if you can.
Sure.
All right, issue number 4 is a frequency imbalance. And we see this all the time in churches that we work with. And it's not just a mixing issue. It's not a frequency imbalance because the front of house engineer is adjusting things poorly. It's the room itself that has a frequency imbalance, which makes the job of the front of house engineer even harder. Right. And the room's materials play a big factor in this, right? Like how the room is built, whether it be drywall walls versus concrete walls. Like drywall absorbs 3 times as much energy as a concrete wall does in lower frequency ranges. So, if you imagine the amount of surface area that it would take to build a church, that's a lot of absorption that you're missing out on if you're going to just a concrete wall, let's say. Same thing with like if you had a drywall ceiling versus a drop tile ceiling, or if you're making a decision of a tile floor versus a carpeted floor. All those decisions are going to impact the frequency imbalance in the room. And the thing with these surface materials, the nice thing is that we can predict this early on. Like we can build a model of the room before even they break ground in the building, and we can show people, okay, man, if we could just add carpet down the aisles, even if it's not underneath the seats, if we can just do the aisles in the back, that's going to really, really help us with this high frequency reverb time. But the placement of these materials too, you don't want to overdo it on some things, because a lot of times a church could be, 20,000 square feet on a ceiling. And if you did that all with like a K13 spray absorption product or a drop tile ceiling, it actually could add more absorption than you even want on just one surface alone. And so we're always trying to balance out and make sure that the lower frequencies, mids, and the highs, they all play well with each other, and they're pretty consistent. And so we're always looking at the material selections, even down to like what types of chairs and pews and different things that are going in there. It's important to factor that in before you finish a design.
Sure.
I want to show this frequency response graph of a church in South Carolina that we worked on, where the blue line was what most of the audience locations performed like. Like this happens to just be one of them, but it was consistent across the board. A lot of these audience locations, I want to zoom in on this 50 hertz peak that's happening, and the blue line has a peak that's probably 15 to 20 dB higher than what the average is in the lower frequency range. But then the red line is the front of house engineer's response.
Oh, wow.
And the front of house engineer had a dip at that frequency. And the difference between the dip and the peak is 106 decibels up to 123 decibels or so. Yeah. That's a big difference there. And since it's a dip for the front of house engineer, what he would do, and by the way, like 50 hertz, like that's right down in the kick drum frequency range, like down low. what he would do is man, that kick drum just feels a little weak to me and thin. I want to boost it.
Right.
And they'd keep boosting it and boosting it. And it would probably end up sounding better for them, standing at that mix position. However, all the audience locations had a 10 to 15 dB peak at that frequency. So all they would be hit with is this low frequency energy. And that was one of the big complaints that everyone in the church had, was that the low end is way too overpowering. Mm-hmm. And it's because, and same thing happened at 40 hertz for them too. There's a big peak that's about 10 to 15 dB discrepancy between what the front of house engineer and what they heard. And so we brought more balance to this room by adding acoustical devices in there that could absorb low frequencies. Mm-hmm. And also we shifted the mix position for the front of house engineer so they weren't right down the center of the room, because that's where a room mode was happening in the space around these frequencies. We shifted them off to the side so that he didn't have as much of a discrepancy here. Nice. So it's important to try to get that balance as best you can. I also want to mention this project we talked about a few times in the past on podcasts, but Christ Fellowship in Port St. Lucie had a 6.5 second reverb time at 125 hertz because it was all concrete on the walls and the floor. And if it was drywall, it would have only been about a second and a half. So the materials that you select to create a balance in the frequency spectrum is really, really important. Okay, the last issue here, we said top 5, so this is the last issue, is sound isolation. And this is something that it's always the hardest thing to deal with in acoustics, is trying to isolate a room and make sure that the sounds from outside aren't disturbing it, or that you aren't disturbing others. Mm-hmm. And so we've worked on churches sometimes that actually have neighbors that are complaining because there's one in particular, the dishes on their walls, like they had dishes on display, would rattle on Sunday mornings when they were ramping up there. And this is probably a football field away.
Sure.
But sound travels very easily, and it can be an issue for that. But then not only exterior to interior, there's also just from room to room within the space where it could be a problem. And so you want to eliminate distractions as best you can, when it comes to like nearby rooms like bathrooms or nurseries or mom's rooms or common areas, anything like that. You want to make sure that everybody in the sanctuary or the auditorium is focused on what they're there for.
Sure.
You don't want them to be worried about what's going on in another space. So the solutions to that is, when you're designing a new space, make sure that you keep isolation in mind, because depending on how it's constructed, it's going to determine how much sound it blocks. Like as far as partitions and the walls, ceilings, floors, you want to make sure that you're building those in a way that's going to block enough sound for you. And we actually have a sound isolation simulator on our website where you can actually listen to how much sound different wall types are going to offer, how much reduction you're going to get. And it's a really helpful tool to kind of set expectations for everybody on the team about how much isolation really is enough. Because it takes a lot. I mean, it's all detail-oriented stuff and making sure that you have a good design, but not just a good design, but that it's implemented properly by the contractors. We also want to isolate existing spaces. We want to add mass typically. So sometimes these walls are thicker and take up more space than a typical wall would. But that's the way that you get isolation, is adding more mass and airspace into the equation. Location is everything when it comes to isolation. Like if you can take the noise sensitive rooms and space them apart from each other, you're going to spend less money on isolating because you have distance between that's going to help you with the reduction of noise. We're quoting a project right now where there's back-to-back rooms where there's two youth rooms that both will probably have a live band playing in it, and they share a wall together, and that's something where there may be some flexibility in the design that we can help with that. But if there's not, then we got to design a really nice wall to try to isolate those two things. So if you can, though, locate things away from each other. Like one of the first things I look at when I see a plan from a church is, okay, you have the auditorium there or the sanctuary. Is there a bathroom that shares a wall with that sanctuary, and plumbing that goes between there? Because every time someone flushes a toilet, you don't want to hear that in the auditorium. Also nurseries and cry rooms and things like that. Like I always look to see where they're located at, see where airlocks are located at, to make sure that we're giving ourselves the best chance for success.
Sure.
So yeah, space planning will be critical. What rooms will be nearby. I'm always looking for that and trying to give people best solutions on that front. All right, so to summarize, what are some of the things to remember from this would be, you don't have to fix these problems alone. Like, we're here to help on that front. Like, we love to even just look at projects to where if you don't decide on hiring us, that's fine. But if we can point out a few things that are going to end up helping you out in the long run, we'd love to do that. We're also... the planning stage is just so important on these projects. Like making sure that we're doing everything we can to get a good result at the end, and it just takes a good plan and a team working together with the architect, the client, and us. We just love being a part of that team. And but the main thing here with houses of worship, I always say that what we want to do is be able to communicate the message properly, and people worship in different ways. A lot of time people will key in on the sermon. Other people love the music, and we got to make it all work. And so that's a great challenge of ours, but we love that responsibility that we get and trying to make these projects as best it can be.
Yeah.
Well, that's been another episode. Thanks for being part of the S.O.U.N.D Project. If your church has any issues that you've been struggling with over the years, we'd love to hear them in the comments below. Just let us know what you're struggling with, and we can comment back and let you know ways that you can improve that. We'll see you next week.